Hey everybody, we're back for another chapter. Sophie and the BFG are off to see the Queen, and we are more than halfway through this book. So let's see what happens. The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still only wearing her nightie, was reclining comfortably in a crevice in the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over, and this folding over bit made a good sort of roof for her and gave her wonderful protection against the rushing wind. What is more, she was lying on skin that was soft and warm and almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever traveled in greater comfort. Sophie peeped over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him about 100 feet in the air. But he had not yet gone into that whizzing top gear of his. When the ground became blurred by speed and the wind howled and his feet didn't seem to be touching anything but air, that would come later. Sophie had not slept in a long time. She was tired. She was also warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again, she looked out over the edge of the ear. The landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now, with mountains and forests. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left. For the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look, quick over there," he said, pointing his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the murky darkness, all she saw at first was a great cloud of dust, about 300 yards away. "Those is the other giants all galloping back home after their guzzle," the BFG said. Then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw all 9 of those monstrous brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. The strides they took were incredible, their speed unbelievable. Their feet pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds, they were gone. A lot of little girlsies and boysies is no longer sleeping in their beds tonight," the BFG said. Sophie felt quite ill. But this grim encounter made her ever more determined to go through with her mission. It must have been an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow his pace. "We is in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with the lights of cars moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have seen anything except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange-colored glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them. "We is close to London," the BFG said. He slowed to a trot. He began looking about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there were still no lights in the windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up yet. "Someone's bound to see us," Sophie said. "Nobody is ever seeing me," the BFG said confidently. "You is forgetting that I is doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching even the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah, yes," he said, "yes, but you was the very first." During the next half hour, things moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in streets, sorry. There were houses everywhere. Sometimes there were shops. There were bright lamps in the streets. There were quite a few people around, and there were cars with lights on, but nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into the shadows. He would glide. That was the only word to describe his way of moving. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the streets of London, his black cloak blending in with the shadows of night. It is quite possible that one or two late-night wanderers might have thought they saw a tall black shadow skimming softly down a murky side street, but even if they had, they never would have believed their own eyes. They would have dismissed it as an illusion and blamed themselves for seeing something that wasn't there. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from the cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered in her under-the-breath voice. "I is in a bit of a puddle," he said. "You're doing marvelously," Sophie whispered. "No, I isn't," he said. "I is now completely boggled. I is lost it." "But why are you lost?" "Because we is meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we is in green pastures." "Oh, don't be silly," Sophie whispered. "This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are." "You is joking." "I'm not. I swear we're almost there." "You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?" said the BFG. "It's just across the road. This is where I take over." "Which way?" the BFG asked. "Straight ahead." The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park. "Now, stop." The BFG stopped. "You see that huge roundabout just ahead of us outside the park?" "I see it." "That is Hyde Park Corner." Even now, when it was an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered, "In the middle of the roundabout, there is an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and rider. Can you see it?" The BFG peered through the trees. "I seeing it." "Do you think that if you took a very fast run, you could jump clear over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch and over the horse and rider and land on the pavement on the other side?" "Easy," said the BFG. "You're sure? You're absolutely sure?" "I promise." "Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner." "Don't be so flussed," the BFG said. "To me that is a snitchy little jump. That is not a thing-a-ling to it." "Then go," Sophie whispered. Then the BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railings that divided it from the street, he took off. It was a gigantic leap. He flew high over Hyde Park Corner and landed, soft as a cat, on the pavement on the other side. "Well done," Sophie said. "Now quick, over the wall." Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. "We're there," Sophie whispered. "We're in the Queen's Garden." Next chapter's called The Palace. "By gumdrops," whispered the big friendly giant. "Is this really it?" "There's the palace." Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mowed lawns and tidy flower beds, the massive shape of the palace loomed through the darkness. It was made of white stone. The sheer size of it staggered the BFG. "But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least." Excuse me. "Easily, I should think," Sophie whispered. "Then I is boggled," the BFG said. "How was I possibly finding the one where the queen is sleeping?" "Let's get a bit closer and have a look," Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began to swivel around. "Hey," Sophie said, "you're going to tip me out." "Shh," the BFG whispered. "I is hearing something." He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to the side of it to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, no more than 50 yards away, she saw a man padding softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog on a leash. The BFG was still as a stone. So was Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness. "You was telling me they had no soldiers in the back garden," he whispered. "He wasn't a soldier," Sophie said. "He was some sort of watchman. We'll have to be careful." "I is not too worried," the BFG said. "Those waxy big ears of mine is picking up even the noise of a man breathing on the other side of the garden." "How much longer before it begins to light?" Sophie whispered. "Very short," the BFG said. "We must go pell-mell for the leather now." He glided forward towards through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when they were walking on gravel. So, the first time I read this, I imagined the way it sounds when I walk on gravel, and I imagined how careful someone must have to be to make no sound walking on a bunch of rocks. Suddenly, they were right up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows, just one flight up, and Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. In all the windows on that floor, the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. In the distance, they could hear the muted sound of traffic going around Hyde Park Corner. The BFG stopped and put his other ear, the one Sophie wasn't sitting in, close to the first window. "No," he whispered. "What are you listening for?" "For breathing," the BFG whispered. "I is able to tell if it is a man being or a lady by the breathing voice. We has a man in there, snortling a little bit too." He glided on, flattening his tall, thin, black-cloaked body against the side of the building. He came to the next window. He listened. "No," he whispered. He moved on. "This room is empty," he whispered. He listened in at several more windows, but at each one he shook his head and moved on. When he came to the window in the very center of the palace, he listened but did not move on. "Ho, ho," he said, "we has a lady sleeping in here." Sophie felt a little quiver go running down her spine. "But who?" she whispered. The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence. He reached up through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light on the walls. It was a dark room, a large room, a lovely room. A rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and on the pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at a face she had seen on stamps and coins and newspapers all her life, and for a few seconds she was speechless. "Is that her?" the BFG whispered. "Yes," Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. The BFG was an expert on windows. He had opened thousands of them over the years to blow his dreams into bedrooms. Some windows got stuck, some were wobbly, some creaked. He was pleased to find the Queen's window slid up like silk. He pushed up the lower half as far as it would go so as to leave a place for Sophie to sit. and next he closed the crack in the curtains. Then, with a finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie up out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge with her legs dangling just inside the room, but behind the curtains. "Now don't you go tip-toppling backwards," the BFG whispered. "You must always be holding on tight with both hands to the inside of the windowsill." Sophie did as he said. It was summertime in London, and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was still only wearing a thin nightie. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, not just to keep her warm, but to hide the whiteness of her nightie from the watchful eyes in the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar out from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now, very cautiously, he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains, far into the room, aiming it at the place where he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath, puffed out his cheeks, and blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very slowly like a thermometer. "Is you all right sitting there?" he whispered. "Yes," Sophie muttered, but she was quite terrified and determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder. The ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. "How long will the dream take to work?" Sophie asked. "Sometimes an hour," the BFG whispered back. "Some is quicker, some is slower still, but it is sure to find her in the end." Sophie said nothing. "I is going to wait in the garden," the BFG whispered. "When you is wanting me, just call my name, and I is coming very quick." "Will you hear me?" Sophie whispered. "You is forgetting these," the BFG whispered, smiling and pointing to his great ears. "Goodbye," Sophie whispered. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek, and Sophie felt like crying. When she turned back to look at him, he was already gone. He had simply melted away into the dark garden. Okay, next time we read, we'll see what happens to the queen and if she believes it and if their plan works. All right, good night, everybody. I'll see you soon.